Welcome to this session on AI, trust and security. So my name's Polly Curtis, I'm the Chief Executive of Demos, and we're concerned about democracy and the interface with technology, which is very relevant to the conversation we're having today. I feel a huge sense of responsibility around this panel. It's possibly the one that if we don't get this right in the next 10 years, we're all going to have a big problem on our hands. So we're tasked today with talking about the potential existential threats posed by AI in areas including war, cyber terrorism, and energy security. And our expert panel is going to talk about how we mitigate those risks as well. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our expert panel. We have Sir Alex Younger, the former MI6 chief, and we have David Van Weel, NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. So welcome to you both, and thank you so much for joining this. So I'm going to start by just asking you to set the scene and paint a picture of what it looks like in 10 years if we get this wrong. What could go wrong when it comes to war, cyber terrorism, and energy security if we don't get the AI regulation and handling right at this point? Shall I start with Sir Alex?
Well, look, thank you, Polly, and it's great to be here. And if I can be a bit strategic at the beginning, break the habit of a lifetime. So let's start at the top. What is the promise of this technology? What is the opportunity? And the claims are pretty big, and Goldman Sachs are traditionally pretty bullish organizations predicting 4% on global economic growth in 10 years. And interestingly, a net job creation from this technology. So my first kind of dystopian proposition is, what if that isn't true? Instead, what if, in practice, this technology confers fabulous riches on a small minority and robs just about everyone else of a purpose and an identity? And I think it's called the meritocracy trap, and I think that is a fantastic risk. The term Luddite is an insult in the English language. It implies someone who's unwilling to accept change or new technology. But the Luddites were right at the time. The new technology that they were protesting about was looms, which was going to destroy their livelihood as weavers. And of course, the technology and the Industrial Revolution it engendered made us all fabulously rich, brought us here today, improved our lives immeasurably. But their lives were destroyed. That generation were essentially rendered destitute. And so while we've got this prediction of new and different jobs for everybody, that transition is going to be politically extraordinarily turbulent. And I fear that if that is mismanaged, and fundamentally the identity, purpose, opportunity, earning power of a big chunk of the population is undermined by this transition, we're going to have a big problem. That's my first point. Secondly, what is good AI? Good AI, to my mind, is simply a technology that augments the human condition. And bad IA, by contrast, is something that substitutes for human beings. It goes back to my first point. But I think we have a problem if in practice this is something that reduces the relevance of people, the people who created it. Then there's something about staying in the loop. Now, I think we'll talk a lot about the dangers of autonomous weapon systems and all of that, but fundamentally, if we're looking at this from the top, we need to be very careful about creating systems that are in charge of what they do, that task themselves. If we've lost that grip as the human race in 10 years' time, I'd argue that we're going to have a problem. And then finally, kind of onto my specialist subject, if you like, there was a hubris when the internet first appeared and these technologies became mainstream. And that hubris was that they were on our side. I speak as liberal democracies. And it was an understandable mistake because, of course, they are democratizing forces. They spread information. On the face of it, they make it hard for people to control what we do and think. They reduce barriers of control. And we thought that, and we were wrong. It turns out possibly that these technologies actually will net out as an advantage to autocrats worldwide and be bent more to purposes of social control than the promotion of the values that we hold dear. And obviously, for me, in my world, that is the big one. I have a question: whose side is this technology on? And if you want a dystopian view of 10 years' time, it's that it turns out that it's not on our side.
Our side being?
That of, however, I'm promising not to be ideological today, but I would say accountable government.
Accountable. Thank you. Thank you for setting the scene and also giving the other view that this is an opportunity as well, because if we divorce the opportunities and the risks, then we won't tackle the true reality of what AI poses.
And the biggest risk is, let's be clear, that we don't take the opportunity. I mean, we're here it's a danger of this panel. We're here to talk about the downside, but you're quite right. We've got to keep a grip of the possibilities of this technology.
Yeah. David?
Yeah, I'd like to continue on a more optimistic note, just to set the scene and to have a bit of a discussion. AI is a foundational technology, and it's a disruptive technology. It is going to be everywhere, like electricity when it came, and it's going to change our lives mainly for the better. Already we can see a lot of examples. I was just on the way in a very long taxi drive over here, watching on X, as it's now called, the new AI translation technology, which can actually make me speak perfect French, which I've never been able to do, with lip sync, etc., etc. Amazing technology. If you read about how ChatGPT is helping medical service spreading around countries like India, where it's very difficult to get to doctors. I mean, those are the kind of changes that AI is making. And I think we should focus that for 80, 90%, this technology will help humankind advance to a better level. Then there's the question, of course, every technology will be used for bad purposes as well. We got the internet, but we also got cybercrime as a result of that. So every technology will also be used by malign actors against us. So we need to shield ourselves against that. And that brings me to the topic that I deal with, which is what is going to be the difference that AI is going to make in warfare. And there we only have to look at Ukraine. And already we can see that AI makes a huge difference. And it's not all about automated systems that kill people without any human control. Those are not out there, I can acquiesce you. And it's something we need to regulate on before we get to that point. But if you look at what AI is now doing for the Ukrainians, it's combining information of a lot of drones, for example, giving it into one command and control center, where they can then point towards a point on the map where Russian forces are building up, so that artillery fire can be directed in that direction. And that takes them 30 seconds instead of 30 minutes if we do it by NATO standards. So it's a huge enhancement. With commercial satellites, they can now see camouflage Russian tanks that are hidden under the foliage of the trees just by using AI and enhancing images. So I would argue that a technology is not bad or good. A technology will help you in achieving better results and getting to more capabilities. But of course, we need to guard ourselves against the malicious use of those technologies against us and protect ourselves. And there the values that Sir Alex mentioned really come into play. How do we make sure that we work by our values and protect ourselves against those who don't?
I feel like in the answers you've both given, they're very balanced, they're very nuanced, and I'm absolutely certain that seeing it in the context of the opportunities as well as the risk is really vital. And the point you make that it can all be used for good as well as bad. But I think if we don't understand the true risk of what AI-enabled warfare will look like, the incentives won't be there to safeguard that in this process. So I'm gonna push you both a little further for an audience that is deeply specialist in kind of AI, but not necessarily in security issues. What does an AI-enabled war look like to both of you?
Yeah, it depends. For us, we're already using AI for predictive maintenance of aircraft, for example. We're using it to count Russian aircraft on military fields, and that saves us about 1,100 man-hours per year. So those forms of AI are slowly permeating our work as well. But of course, they're not on the edge of life and death. I think when it comes to AI that is really in the sharp end of our work, which is in weapon systems, then we really come to the critical choices of how do we want this to be ethical? How do we make sure that that AI is coherent with our norms and values? And at NATO, that's why we've written a strategy on responsible use for AI in security and defense. And we've outlined principles for that. So we want accountability, we want lawfulness in the AI, we want bias mitigation in the AI. So all these things need to be designed into the AI if you want to work with NATO. And we've also made that across the board. So for all 32 nations, AI has to adhere to these principles. And we're now in the business of operationalizing them into certification standards.
I'd love to come back to that as we kind of explore the mitigations, but my question to Sir Alex, what does an AI war
Well,
look
you want the spy view. Naturally, it's that we lose a war before we've even fought it. And that's because AI has been maliciously employed to erode our will or our capability or our social cohesion to the point that we don't have the capacity even to resist in the way that David's operation is mandated to organize. So naturally, I'm a creature of the hybrid and the sub-threshold conflict. But be clear, the sub-threshold conflict, the point of that is to prevail without firing a shot. And if you look at, for instance, Xi Jinping's current approach to Taiwan, I'm convinced that that is exactly his aim, is to win without fighting.
For people who don't know the context, just explain that another layer.
Well, I think we'll talk about it more, Polly, but we must face the fact that this is a insidious and pernicious technology for all of its benefits that risks fundamentally undermining most of the things that pin together a free society. And as Ukraine is demonstrating beyond any shadow of a doubt, capability and technology really matter, but will is the key determinant, the will to win, the understanding that you're fighting for the right reasons, and your ability to retain your cohesion as a society. And let's not be under any illusion, these systems can be optimized to undermine that. And that's an asymmetric vulnerability, because again, I'm being very philosophical and it's after lunch and I apologize, but really this war in Ukraine, for instance, it's a war between a centralized regime and a decentralized regime. And our decentralized regimes, they have amazing power because they trust individuals, they delegate responsibility, they're intrinsically innovative. But those networks are extremely vulnerable to this type of technology. So, my former opposite numbers on the Russian side, this is what they're thinking of. How do you apply technology to sap the will of your opponent?
Wow. My next question actually builds on that, and I was going to come to you, Sir Alex, to ask you about how this technology could change the world order, and specifically about China's role in that. Can you unpack that a bit? Kind of, are we in an arms race with China to develop the best AI system?
So, it's predictable, and I don't want to be all Dr. Strangelove, but yes. I think if I look at the things that will condition the choices that my children enjoy, that the two big ones are the outcome of the previous conversation, whether there's actually a planet for them to live in. And this is the other one. Whose side is technology on? Because again, without wanting to sound too ideological, you have, as well as decentralized and centralized, you have two value systems essentially in operation in the world now, apart from the kind of Millwall lot, the hooligans like Russia and Iran and stuff. One's top-down and one is bottom-up. And a top-down society is completely dependent on being able to steward and control the information in its environment. And that's China. It shouldn't have been possible, I've already said. We assumed the internet would make that stuff not doable. Amazingly, they've managed it. The big firewall, they're in a position to optimize conditions so as they can assert social control through all of these platforms that are supposed to be setting people free. And of course, these technologies make that much more of an issue. Now, China, I think, faces a number of headwinds, which we perhaps aren't ready for this panel. So to cut a long story short, I believe that really the outcome of this competition that's growing as between these different value systems is fundamentally about who can realize a technology strategy most effectively, whose side is this stuff on. I think, moreover, that China has come to that conclusion more effectively and more quickly than we have. And you don't have, you don't need to listen to a spy to tell you this. It's been published, this Made in China strategy. It's a really good strategy. And it seeks, quote, to allow China to dominate the key emerging technologies, quantum, AI, robotics, synthetic biology, etc. And it's a good swept up piece of work with a lot of annexes. So my first question is, what's our version of that? And my second question is it going to work? Can we organize quickly enough to ensure that we have these technologies, or will China? Let's quickly think about why China's so focused on this issue, and I'd give you 3 examples. The first is, if you run an authoritarian regime, you have to have this stuff, and it has to work for you, and it has to support the proposition that the Communist Party should be in control, and regrettably, it seems to be quite useful. Secondly, and completely understandably and sensibly, I think the Communist Party in China see these technologies as a means of creating a big step change in productivity that can overcome their demographic crisis and other economic problems that they face. Fine, same with us. Thirdly, and crucially to your question, whoever is on top of this stuff can probably lock in their advantage and engineer a situation where the rest of the world is dependent on its goods and services, and where this top-down version of the internet is the default, if not for the West, for everyone who lies in between. And that is a bad outcome for us at that point. If we become completely dependent on hardware and software from a potentially adversarial value system, I think we've got a big problem. At that point, you really are facing the prospect of fighting a war or losing a war before it's begun. So it's long-winded way of saying that this innovation race really matters. Now, who's going to win? This is my final point. It's really interesting. I was rather depressed about all of this. I asked my Chinese colleagues who was going to win. They were surprisingly open. They said, China will win anything where centralization is rewarded, and you, the West, will win anything where decentralization is rewarded. And I think they're right. And the really interesting thing about generative AI is it's not clear to me, actually, therefore, who's got the advantage.
Whether it's centralized.
Yeah, but all I can say is that through luck or judgment, the West has got a break by being the first with the large language models, because they have the opportunity, if it continues to be the case that you are rewarded to scale, that you need increasing compute to make the next model, then it happens that the US has kind of got their hands around that. The tech controls are designed to preserve their lead. These models need to be trained at internet scale. That's actually a problem for China. They can't really do that. And most deliciously of all, these models actually pose a risk to the integrity of an autocratic regime. You can train them, but you can't necessarily train them to produce an answer that is ideologically appropriate. So this technology has given us an opportunity. I would otherwise be a bit pessimistic. I think the raw innovative power and the long-term thinking available in China, it could be a decisive factor to our disadvantage. But it's much more open now, just to be optimistic.
Do you think do you think governments and the global bodies get this challenge?
So governments increasingly do, I think. There is, so I'm a massive Atlanticist. I'm a huge admirer of the US. I think they have capabilities that are widely underestimated. But of course, I think they've also been heedless of a key enabler, which is alliances. And this has got to be seen as an alliance effort, not just a US one. And I think now there are examples of this now being used to effect. And one that I would highlight is AUKUS, the UK, US, Australia pact, which is very much a capability and technology pact, along with the stuff about submarines. So I think we are slowly waking up. But let's face it, we're not going to win by doing our version of the 5-year plan or Made in China 25. It's just not how it operates. This is about our capacity to innovate our way and to harness our creative energy to stuff that's really going to make a difference. So governments have a concerting role. I think there's been a failure in public-private partnership. It's vital to sort that out as well. There's a lot to be confident about, but at the moment, but it's one of the reasons I like having conversations like this. I think we need to focus on it more.
David, do you want to respond to that? How is NATO thinking about that set of dynamics?
Well, I'll be the optimist again from the start on this. I believe that our open democratic societies, by definition, are better in innovating. Just because innovation needs collaboration, it needs to break down barriers, it suffers under tight control. So China has tried to mirror our way of open innovation, but the Communist Party is very scared of open innovation, so it shuts down on it as well. And if you do that a few times, then the model is dead. And what you're left with then is stealing technology, is buying scientists, is cooperating with Western universities to have them opening faculties in your nation, but that's not a durable model. So in the long run, I'm pretty confident that our democratic societies will out-innovate an authoritarian regime like China. That doesn't solve the issue for the short term, however, and that is that a centralist regime is able to very quickly gear all resources towards one point, including spying, including stealing technology, buying technology, illicit or illicit, pouring huge amounts of money into developing, for example, a semiconductor industry. So we need to protect ourselves against that. We need to provide an alternative. We need to keep our own industries, our own ecosystems going. And from a NATO perspective, I would say we're pretty confident that our ecosystems are in a good place. But the adoption of technology by the military is in a very bad place. And that's because we've lost track of each other over the past decades. So we need to re-engage, and I'd really emphasize that point. The public-private partnership here is crucial because new technologies come out of the private sector. I was just in the White City campus of Imperial. That's where it happens. It doesn't happen at NATO headquarters, it happens there. And you're the ones that need to help us with your technology in defending our democracies.
And are you getting the engagement you need from big tech? Is big tech up for this challenge?
Big tech is, I would say, because they see what kind of vital role they play. I'll just name Microsoft and Amazon as two examples who have played a huge role in the beginning of the war in Ukraine in helping the Ukrainian government move to the cloud so they can keep their services up and running. And they're still doing that, so they see the mission. But it's not only big tech, it's also startups, it's also young innovators. We just launched 3 challenges in the field. One of them is on secure information sharing, another one on sensing and surveillance. And we opened that up to the startups, asking them for solutions, technological solutions, to help us. And we've got an overwhelming 1,300 startups from all across the alliance that want to work with us on dual-use technologies that can be used commercially, but also in the field of defense and security. So I'm hopeful. Of course, Ukraine helped. But it's not about working for defense is bad and working for anything else is good. No, it's about what is the mission that your technology is employed in. And I think we have a good mission and a good story to tell there.
That completely changed during my career. I think when we had some bumps in the road, pretty famous ones, but there was something of a disdain for national security work within the tech community. There was a West Coast haze that was quite utopian and in my view a bit naive, if fundamentally extremely innovative. And with some exceptions now, that's totally changed.
What do you think sparked that change?
I think events, by and large, I mean, as David said, obviously Ukraine has been a culminating factor, but it's my request for to tech was not that they endorse, the instructions of the deep state or, become like us, but they need to recognize their responsibility in the context of what I've been saying. Because the reality is none of those companies are going to prosper without the continuance of liberal democratic capitalism. They are part of the ecosystem. And that slightly more dispassionate way of looking at it, I think, has justified their approach. But I think the other one, and now I reflect on it, was terrorism, which very much changed the image of intelligence services as being something in the shadows that people didn't really understand to very quickly people understanding their reliance on us to literally stop bombs going off. And at that point, your attitude is very different.
Yeah. Just going back to David's earlier point about democracy actually, our democratic structures giving us a potential advantage in the AI international arms race. What the opposite of that is that democracy could also be under threat. I wonder, Sir Alex, whether you could talk a bit about.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where the loop closes. So we possess an asymmetric vulnerability. So in order for a democracy to function, democracies exist to contest the facts, but fundamentally there needs to be a commonality of sort of assumptions and access to something approximating to the truth or facts or data for our system to operate. And by operate, I mean be legitimate and therefore enjoy the support of the populations and be robust. These technologies are rapidly eroding our capacity to discriminate truth from lie. Now, the reason this is such a big deal is that is not only not a vulnerability for autocrats, it's an asset. So if you're in the business of non-accountable government, where there are no peaceful arrangements for the transfer of power, you're just interested in top-down conveying an authorized version of the facts. This technology makes that easier. For us, the advent of these types of technologies is going to make it, I think, an order of magnitude harder now for people to make informed decisions intrinsic for the operation of democracy. And this is close in. 24 is going to be one of the most democratically consequential years that I can remember, with elections in the United States, in the UK, in Taiwan, in Russia, all sorts of different places where consequential decisions will be being made in an environment where disinformation is becoming increasingly effective. And I worry a lot about that. Now, as it happens, I think there are already a set of safeguards that can be put in place. But I would add finally that this isn't just about the actions of malign, hostile states. In practice, I think a lot of these technologies are actually optimized to elevate social discord and suppress empathy as a matter of a marketing strategy. And that this, I'm sure that consequence is unintended, but this is piling on to the problem we've already got with deliberate disinformation. So this, if you know, I'm an optimist by nature. You have to be if you're a human intelligence officer. But this, I think, is an issue that isn't getting enough attention.
Interestingly, we at Demos are running a campaign at the moment to get the UK political parties to develop and publish AI policies ahead of the election, because actually they don't have a policy in place, and there are so many vulnerabilities in the system. How are you thinking about kind of that disinformation piece at NATO? I was also interested in your thoughts around bias in systems as well.
Yeah, on disinformation, I mean, it's already here. It's always been a part of warfare, that if you can dissuade your opponent's way of thinking or the backing in his population, then you actually win the war without fighting it. And these technologies help in spreading that disinformation. And I do agree that our democracies are vulnerable, especially if people are being encouraged to stay in certain bubbles, which then polarizes our population and makes them very vulnerable. And there have been examples where one state-driven party has been responsible for organizing a violent demonstration by enticing both sides to show up at one point. Now, you can only imagine that if some experts say that in 5 years, 90% of the online content is fake, then that's a huge task. But for us, the answer lies in resilience. We have to make our populations resilient to this threat of disinformation. The Ukrainian population was very resilient. There were deep fakes of Zelensky in the beginning of the war announcing that the Ukrainian army had already given up, that the Russians have won, but it didn't have a big effect. In Taiwan, where there's a constant stream of disinformation, the population has become very resilient. So I think every instrument becomes blunt, and it's up to us to help people see the difference whilst being a trustworthy partner between good information and bad information.
Do you think it's fair to ask ordinary people to be the solution to such kind of deeply baked in systems designed to manipulate and...
Well, I think we have to be against manipulation. I think we need to do everything we can in creating trustworthy AI, but there will be parties in the world that will use our open systems in spreading disinformation. And I often refer to a pamphlet that the Swedish government provides to their whole population every year on civil defense. And rule number one is your government will not surrender. Whatever you hear from an occupier, it is not true. That's the form of resilience, I mean. It doesn't mean that these people are responsible. It means that from the outset, you are more clear in your communication about what is likely to happen, what is not likely to happen, what are the values that we stand for or not. And that's increasing the resilience without having to have the population actually take over responsibility.
Yeah.
I think you can put some of this onto the platforms and those providing the technology. They need to be fully incentivized to implement this stuff in a way that makes it easier to safeguard. But again, I'm sorry to do so much philosophy this afternoon, but democracy's got a fundamental problem about who's in charge of the truth. There's nobody outside the machine that is sufficiently disinterested to say what's true or not. Now, this is obviously the autocracies are in a different position. They're just going to say what's true. When you look at the argument in the UN about how cyberspace should be organized, these problems aren't a problem if you are following a doctrine the Chinese refer to as modern IP, their version of the internet. You're just told what the truth is. Now, there's no way in our system that you can have a group of people, maybe Demos could do it, but who would be themselves accountable and that could be assumed to be a disinterested party. So I agree with you. It's painstaking, but it's about education. It's about critical thinking and inculcating those values really early on. And I don't think the effort's there. On the contrary, I'd say that we're pretty casual about this stuff.
I'm keen to move on to your thoughts about kind of how we mitigate and make this safe. And I'm hearing immediately a tension between we have to win the technology race, but we have to make it safe and regulate it to make it safe. But could the regulation actually inhibit the innovation? How do you square that circle? David?
I heard someone say, so it's not mine, but Brussels is like the Silicon Valley of regulation, as opposed to the Silicon Valley of innovation, which is the real Silicon Valley. There's some truth to that, but I think the real truth should lie in the middle. We should quickly regulate. We're too slow in our regulatory processes to keep up with technology. At the same time, we need to be agnostic of where a technology will move in the future, where we don't know now where it is. That sounds really philosophical to get into your point, but if we now regulate AI on the basis of where AI stands now, then in 2 years' time, that will be obsolete regulation, and it will probably inhibit us in innovating to the next level. At the same time, if we wait for generative AI to come out and not regulate it and see in 5 years what will become of it, I think we will regret it. Yes. So for me, the truth is in the middle. We need to be very tech savvy in governments, in parliaments, as a population about what's coming towards us. And then we need to be quick in creating smart regulation that is adaptable and that keeps up with the pace of technology. And sometimes I joke that you can now get fined if you let your Tesla drive itself. I would argue that in 10 years, it's the other way around. You will get fined if you drive yourself. And that's not just because of technology, it's also because of philosophy, because we've come to deal with the fact that technology will then be allowed to take over because it's proven to be safer than a human is, and we've come to philosophically accept that fact. Yeah. That's the kind of flexibility that I would like in regulation that is very, very needed now.
Thank you. Alex?
Well, I half agree with you, David. So I'm complete, having overseen the formation of laws in the UK Parliament to authorise us to use various technologies. I couldn't agree more on the madness of writing laws about specific technologies, because by the time it's gone through the system, it's out of date, and you suddenly find yourself, trapped into having to use vinyl records rather than whatever you want, because the law's just not written. And in any case, good law is around principles, not objects. And in my business, the intelligence business, we have 2 golden principles of necessity and proportionality. That's what distinguishes us from our authoritarian opponents, and you can write that stuff into law. Where I'm afraid I'm I'm less optimistic is that there is some regulatory silver bullet here, or at least one that isn't fundamentally counterproductive. We, because of the history of 20th century Europe, rightly, and I think understandably, focus on privacy as an absolute concern. We've all read in history or even personally experienced the effects of overweening and overpowerful governments fundamentally disrupting and interfering in people's lives. We're never going there again. So I can understand, particularly in places like Brussels and the European Commission, a real obsession with privacy and a laudable instinct to look at this in ethical terms, which I applaud. But if the net result of that is that it becomes impossible to innovate because the regulatory requirements are too onerous, particularly for this vital layer that we've talked about, the startup and the new entrants, here's what will happen. We will become dependent on China for our basic digital goods and services. And what price privacy at that point? There will be no such thing. Our world will be transparent to an autocratic regime. We'll be weakened economically. And I also think that fundamentally we will be in a hard power, a position of hard power weakness. I think we've got to be extraordinarily careful. And I think Brussels has drunk the Kool-Aid as a regulatory superpower without noticing that there are no global scale technology companies in Europe. And I'm afraid there is a link. So I'm not advocating that we be cavalier, and I hope I'm coming over as someone who does think about the ethics of hard power and soft power. But we're deluding ourselves if we think that the rules are the thing that are going to keep us safe in this environment. Maybe it's more about the values. And fundamentally, it's about unleashing our capacity to innovate. And by the way, on that, I'm inspired by your optimism, David, if still very worried about it.
On the privacy point, I'd die in a ditch for privacy rights and laws and all of those things, but actually our kind of collective values internationally are out of step with the way people are behaving now on the internet as well. It's very, very different. I
mean, people would give their data to Tesco's perfectly happily. They won't give it to the government.
They won't give it to the government. Yeah. I'm going to ask you both to sum up in the last couple of minutes by saying what practically would you do now to get this right, and then what's the longer term kind of principles we need to set? So just a little question, 1 minute each. David.
1 minute each, wow, that's already 5 seconds in thinking. I'm going to get this into 1 minute. What we're doing at NATO now, one, we realize that if we want to work with innovators, we need to show that we're a trustworthy user of new technologies. So for every disruptive technology we see, we're writing strategies and we're taking our principles into how we want to use that technology. We've done it for AI, we've done it for the use of data, for autonomous systems. The next one coming up is quantum. And then next year we're working on biotech and human enhancement with, of course, a lot of ethical questions. So that's one. We want to be a tech-savvy, responsible user of technology, and we want to operationalize that. So we've brought together a data and AI review board with people from all over the alliance. We have ethics professors, entrepreneurs, lawmakers, people from the government and the military, and they're advising us collectively on how to operationalize using AI in a responsible way for NATO. So that's one aspect. And then the second aspect, so I would call that fostering. The other element is protecting. We have a responsibility to keep an eye on authoritarian regimes and how they are using this technology. And if they're not using it by the same values as we do, how do we then protect ourselves and our societies against the use of that technology? And that's, well, that ties into your pessimism. All I can say is we see the risk and we're working on it.
Thank you. Sir Alex.
So pessimistically, I think they are intrinsically going to be using it in ways that are inimical to our interests. Optimistically, I think we should listen to what my Chinese counterpart said. I don't know if it was a self-serving observation. We'll win anything that rewards centralization. You will win anything that involves decentralization. And I think that's what's come out of this conversation. We've got an incredible ecosystem. I think the problem at the moment is it's incentivized and optimized in a way that doesn't necessarily capture the importance of what we're talking about. It's a bit like climate change. It's an externality which has gone unpaid and uncosted. So we've got to find ways of making it to this audience and to the broader ecosystem. The incentive is that we concert our activities to make these technologies safe, and let's be really blunt, to give us a cutting edge when it comes to defending our democracies.
Listen, I've hugely enjoyed the philosophical nature of this conversation, but the practical kind of conclusion that we landed on there. So thank you both for your contributions. That idea of whose side is the tech on, that's the thing that I'm taking away from this conversation to really think about in our future work on this. So thank you so much for both of your time and really very valuable contributions. So thank you.